Good morning. This is Todd Brand. I'm here with Ryan Green this morning, and we are thankful for each of you that we see logging on to participate in our webinar. We are going to touch on a subject today, two of them that we love dearly, one called grandparents and one called education. And having gone through a significant amount of planning over the years around this subject, Ryan has taken to putting some things together that we think will really help you as grandparents address this situation in your own families. And for the next 45 minutes, we'll share some content about that very special relationship that we can have as grandparents to grandchild, and money and education added to that mix. And as many of you are aware, it is an easy decision to decide, yes, I want to help with the education of future generations, and it is a fairly easy conversation to understand 529s in concept, but how the intricacies of such planning play in your own unique situation can get a little bit complicated. So we'll try to peel back the covers on that today, and as each of you may be wrestling with this issue, please know that today is a flyover of the subject matter, and in your unique situation we want to try to help you very specifically do something to pass on a legacy of education. And so I picked a quote actually to get us started that you'll see now: education without values, as useful as it is, seems to rather make a man a more clever devil. And I like C.S. Lewis, but want to just share that part of the education process that we hope to accomplish today is to weave in some wisdom on how that can be accomplished, not just to get an education paid for. So Ryan, I'd ask you to go ahead and jump into the content when you're ready. And I would, one last note for each of you, there's a box on your screen where you can type in questions. So as you go through this webinar with us, if you have any questions, please type those in. I'll see those, and we'll come back at the end of the formal conversation and try to address as many of those as we can get to in the time allotted. So again, thank each of you for joining us. We're privileged to have you on the call. Ryan?
Yes, thank you, Todd. And again, welcome, and thank you everyone out there for joining us. This is something that for a while here at Brand we've had a passion around. That's just another related element to the massive mosaic picture that is financial planning for a family, and with college tuition getting more and more ludicrously expensive, it's becoming more and more important from that. I always get a kick out of having some clients join us and regaling us with the stories of what it cost them for their first semester at Mizzou, and think of something in the hundreds of dollars versus the tens of thousands that it is now. So this is a very important topic and one that we definitely take seriously. Before we get into the material, I should just note that my job today is not to try to pretend to be an accountant. These are tax-related plans. They have tax benefits. There's also some tax pitfalls there as well. Again, I'm not going to try to pretend to be your accountant. What I would do is encourage you to, if you're thinking about any advanced 529 strategy that, of course, we're happy to discuss with you, be sure to bounce that off your account. Make sure there's no unintended tax consequences that we're not picking up on. So just a couple of real quick data points. Fidelity did a study a couple of years ago where they discussed grandparent-owned 529s and college funding for grandparents, and learned that 72% of grandparents feel it's important to help with education funding for the grandchildren. 90% of them indicated that they would help pay for that college education if only the parents asked. And a lot of times what we're finding is the conversation just doesn't happen. So for you grandparents out there, if it's something that you're interested in doing, maybe you shouldn't wait for that request to come from the parents of the child, your kids. Maybe you should initiate that conversation, again, if it's something that's important to you. TIAA-CREF, who's a pretty big name in the education industry, did another study that indicated only 16% of grandparents feel they're knowledgeable in the space of college funding, especially as it relates to 529. So there seems to be a pretty strong need for the planning discussion out there, and not that many people really understand exactly how the plans work. Today's conversation is going to be a little bit custom tailored to one element of 529 planning, and that really is how a grandparent can effectively use their 529 balances if there's a concern about jeopardizing financial aid, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as we move into this. So the first thing that's important to understand is, what are we talking about when we're talking about financial aid? What we're talking about is need-based financial aid. This isn't merit-based aid that would be an award given based on the academic achievements of the child. This is strictly financial need related. Now that can be either at the university level, where they can offer things like university-specific grants, or they can offer work-study programs. These can also be at the federal level, so these would be things like Pell Grants or access to subsidized federal student loans. And what drives all of that is the free application for federal student aid, which is a very, very fun, time-intensive application that parents in most cases get to go through for the benefit of their child to determine what they call the expected family contribution. That is looking at the parents and the students. What are their assets? What are their income? And it's a very, very complicated formula that arrives at an expected family contribution. And if that expected family contribution is low enough, then some aid may be available for that student. So how does that relate to 529s? Well, depending on the ownership structure of the 529, that can have different impacts on that expected family contribution. For example, if the student owns investment assets, let's say they've got just a brokerage account somewhere and it's got some value to it, they would consider that to be a student-owned asset, and that would be something that would count on that expected family contribution. Specifically related to 529s, if that student owns a 529 account, that account can be included at an up to 5.64% added to the expected family contribution. The same thing holds true for parent-owned 529. So if either the student or the parent owns a 529, that FAFSA is going to reflect that value at a 5.64% maximum inclusion rate. Now, it really doesn't mean much unless you compare that to the grandparent-owned 529, which most people think, well, hey, a grandparent 529 is not listed anywhere on that application, so it's not included for FAFSA purposes and therefore won't impact aid. That's not accurate at all. In fact, even though the asset doesn't show up, the distributions from that 529, so if the child's a freshman and there's a tuition need and the grandparent says, okay, time for me to step in, use this account as it was intended, I'm going to facilitate a distribution from the 529 to pay for this semester's tuition, that actually shows up as income for the student. And that's included on that application at a 50% inclusion rate when determining the expected family contribution. So again, student-owned and parent-owned 529s, the account value is included at a 5.64% rate, while the income distributed from a grandparent-owned 529 is included at a 50% rate. That can have a very meaningful impact on any aid that may be available for that student. In other words, it looks like, for application purposes, that student has a higher degree of income than they really do, when really it's just a distribution from a grandparent on 529. That's one of the biggest, I wouldn't say pitfalls, but one of the biggest planning opportunities that it's important to be mindful of when you're contemplating funding a grandparent-owned 529. There's different strategies that you can utilize to kind of work around that potential pitfall, and that's what we're going to move into next. So there's a lot of different things that you could do as far as using the 529 balances, but for today's purposes, we've kind of grouped them into three core aid-related strategies. The first would be to say, okay, I'm a grandparent, I've got a 529, my grandchild's getting ready to head off to school. How am I going to use this account? So if they're even eligible for financial aid, that's the first question I suppose you need to ask yourself is, does it even matter? Is my grandchild even going to be able to obtain financial aid? If your kids, their parents, have reasonably strong incomes, significant assets, it's pretty difficult to fathom that there's going to be any financial aid available for that student. So it may not be that big of an issue to begin with. And remember, we're not talking about merit and athletic-based aid. Those are completely unrelated to today's discussion. This is just a needs-based aid conversation. So with that in mind, you just ask yourself, what's my aim? How do I want to use these accounts given the child is eligible for some financial aid? So the first strategy would be to say, I want to make sure that I preserve the maximum amount of eligible needs-based aid that my grandchild is going to be eligible for. In other words, I want to keep the impact from the 529 that I own off of that FAFSA application. To do that, you would basically handle one strategy that we'll go through here in a second. The next strategy would be to say, listen, I've got a 529 available for my grandchild to use for school, and they're going to use it the way that it was intended. I'm not going to be concerned with the loss of aid. We'll let others that don't have the same adequate resources use that aid. I'm going to use the 529 for its intended purposes and just ignore the impact to financial aid that may be available. The third one would be to just kind of combine the two. Life is rarely black and white, and sometimes it's hard to make a decision on one option versus another, and you could always kind of quote unquote split the difference, and I'll show you a little bit what that looks like here momentarily. So this is a real high-level overview of the first strategy where we're attempting to preserve the maximum amount of financial aid. And remember here that distributions from grandparent-owned 529s are going to show up as income for that student. So if you wanted to preserve the maximum amount of financial aid, you would need to keep that income amount low for the student, which means you wouldn't want to use a 529 distribution to cover that tuition shortfall. So in the example here, the gray areas that show up as financial aid, those are pretty much self-explanatory. That would be the aid that's available for the student. And assuming that aid doesn't meet the entire tuition need for the year, well, you can do one of two things. You can either process a 529 distribution, or you can utilize student loans. For today's conversation, I'm going to ignore the possibility that the parents or the grandparents could just cash flow that shortfall. That's definitely a possibility, but for today's purposes, I just want to illustrate this as it relates to the 529 plan. So in the first year, there's a tuition shortfall that's not being met by financial aid, and if we don't want to utilize a 529 distribution to cover that shortfall, we need to turn to a student loan. Ideally, in a perfect world, this would be a subsidized student loan, whereby interest doesn't begin accruing until after the child has graduated from college. Basically, it's a free loan until you get to the point of graduation, and then after that point, they expect you to start repaying it, and the interest starts clocking up on it. But if those aren't available, then unsubsidized would be the next recourse. So another important thing to keep in mind here is that the FAFSA application, when we're considering income, actually, this is a brand new change that's just taken into effect, looks backwards 2 years, which means that when you're into your third year of college, when the grandchild's into their third year of college, they're going to look at the income from that child's freshman year. That's important, and it'll help make this diagram make a little bit more sense. So when we're freshman year, we're determining how we're going to cover this tuition shortfall. We're going to need to use student loans to be able to preserve the financial aid that's available. You'll have to do the same thing the second year. So when they're in their sophomore year, again, a student loan is going to be needed to cover that shortfall. But once they're headed into their junior year, again, remember that the FAFSA application is going to look at the income from the first year. Well, you didn't process a 529 distribution because you used student loans that year instead. So now you can go ahead and begin the 529 distributions to cover the need in the third year and the fourth year, because you've already cleared that income year from the freshman year and that income year from the sophomore year where you didn't have any 529 distributions. At that point, the income from the 529 distributions doesn't matter anymore on the FAFSA, so you've, across all 4 years, preserved the maximum amount of financial aid. Now, it's important to remember also that we're talking about a 4-year college track here, which doesn't necessarily, as much as we'd like it to, always happen. So if there was a 5th year, you would just shift everything over and you would have 1 additional year of student loans. Of course, you would need to know that it was going to be a 5-year plan by the time that the 3rd year was upcoming, which most people, I would hope, would have a handle on it by that point. So when you've gotten to the end of that process, you've now finished school and you've maximized the available financial aid. The downside is, well, since you couldn't take 529 distributions the first and the second year, you've got this student loan balance, which again, hopefully, if this was a subsidized loan, there's not been any interest up until this point, but you still need to find a way to repay that amount. At that point, what you could consider is transferring ownership to the now graduated student and then they would take a non-qualified 529 distribution to repay that loan amount. Now, unfortunately, there is pretty good code on that out there that a distribution to repay a student loan is not considered to be a qualified education expense, which means that distribution is going to be subject to tax and subject to a 10% penalty. But the idea here is that that student has just graduated, they're at a relatively low income bracket still, so the tax to them isn't going to be terribly burdensome, and the 10% penalty is only going to be on the gain. Hopefully that's a modest enough amount that it's worth paying when considering that you saved all of that financial aid over those years. In other words, the tax and penalty amounts to considerably less than the aid that you preserved by following this strategy. So that would be one way to think about using the 529 in this particular situation. The second would be to say, okay, I'm just going to ignore the impact of financial aid, and I'm just going to use the 529 for its intended purposes. I'm going to keep it simple. I set money aside for my grandchild to go to school. They're now in school. I'm not going to worry about any financial aid that they may be eligible for. That can be used for other students. Less of a consideration at the federal level, but some schools, especially smaller schools, only have so many student aid dollars to go around, and if you feel it's important to you that other, maybe more needier students will be able to use that aid, then this would be one way to kind of go about that and just actually use the 529 like it was planned, which there's no magic here. It's as simple as when you start out, your financial aid amount is going to be less than it was in the prior strategies, and you use the 529 to cover any shortfall. There's no student loans involved here. When you get to the end of the fourth year, that'd be it. There's no loan to repay. You've gotten whatever aid you could, but the 529 was used for its intended purposes. So that one's pretty simple and straightforward. The third strategy is to kind of split the difference between the two of them. So in this case, again, we've just combined the first and the second approach to say in the first year, when the child's entering school, we're going to try to preserve some financial aid. And remember, if we process a distribution from the 529 that's owned by a grandparent, that's going to show up as income from the student, and that's going to hamper future years' access to financial aid. So the first year, we're going to use a student loan to cover that shortfall. The next year, that's when we're going to flip that switch, and we're going to begin to use the 529, which again, given the 2-year lag, preserves your financial aid for the first year and the second year, but after that, those distributions kind of catch up with you, and you can see that the financial aid number has been reduced. And then when you get to the end of it, you do the same thing. You could transfer ownership to the student, let them take a non-qualified distribution, subject to tax at their own rate and 10% penalty on that gain amount. They repay a smaller loan now because they only had to borrow 1 year instead of 2 years. One thing I'll note here as it relates to transfer of ownership is it wouldn't necessarily have to take place at the end of the college run or at that graduation. You could consider transferring ownership to the student earlier in this process. And the reason you may want to consider doing that is because, if you'll recall, a student-owned asset is only included at the expected family contribution level of 5.64%, as opposed to the income from a grandparent-owned 529 being included at 50%. So just looking at the numbers, it may make sense to consider transferring ownership to that student rather than taking distributions from a grandparent-owned 529s in an effort to try to preserve even more of that financial aid. Of course, you need to look at your grandchild and say, is this a person that I feel comfortable with handing over the reins, handing over the control of this, what very well could be a very meaningful asset? In other words, if an 18-year-old who's a freshman in college now has an account that they control, and let's say there's $100,000 into it, you would want to have a high degree of confidence that they wouldn't just withdraw that money, go buy a car, go take a trip, do some other things that weren't intended to use that balance. So the financial responsibility of that student is definitely a consideration in that strategy. One way to kind of even split that difference even further is you could actually do partial ownership transfers. So whatever that expected shortfall was in any of those given years, you don't transfer the entire 529 balance right in the beginning. You just transfer whatever that shortfall is. So if you're $25,000 of need in that first year or second year, whatever the case is, you just transfer that amount of ownership to the child. That way, the hope is they don't have access to the full account, and they would only use that amount to cover the tuition shortfall and not do things they shouldn't do with it. Along those same lines, you may ask the question, well, why wouldn't I just transfer ownership to the parent, my son or daughter, and let them control the account because it's included at that same 5.64 percentage point. And again, that would have some value as far as control of that asset is concerned, because now instead of the student controlling that asset, the parent owns that asset and controls that asset. But there is a potential impact if that same parent has more than one child in school at the same time, because for FAFSA purposes, they're going to aggregate all parent-owned balances. So if you've got more than one grandchild in school and you transfer ownership to the parents, when each of those individual child completes their FAFSA, it's going to aggregate those parent-owned 529 balances and have a little bit more of a meaningful impact. So again, it really gets down to the family dynamic when it comes to what's the best way. Do I want to maintain strict ownership throughout this process, only turning over what's left of the account to the student at the very end when they've graduated? Or do I want to allow the parent to exercise some control, even though that may have a little bit of an impact on the FAFSA, not as much aid available? Or do I feel perfectly comfortable saying, yes, my grandson's 18 years old, but he has a wonderful head on his shoulders, he's never been anything but perfectly responsible, never made a bad decision in his life, then maybe it's a little bit easier to turn over the reins to him at that time. Which kind of leads us now to, okay, so there's all these different options. I've got this 529 balance. Let's assume that financial aid is on the table. Which one of these options is right for me? How do I make this decision? What do I need to be thinking about to ensure that I make the correct decision? Or earlier on in the planning opportunity, let's just say I've got a brand new grandchild and I'm thinking about funding these. Am I going to be a little bit more cautious with my funding because I'm not exactly sure how I'm going to use these 18 years from now when that grandchild actually goes to school? So understanding some of these planning opportunities going into this process can be helpful. And when it comes down to it, there's no one quick answer. There's no, this is the solution for you, this is the recommended strategy, because it primarily depends on two things. What's your vision for the account? How do you envision this account getting used for the student? And then what does your own family dynamic look like? This gets back to what I just mentioned about the financial responsibility for the student, even the financial responsibility for the parent, right? Do I feel comfortable with them having some control over this? So as it relates to those, there's some important considerations that you can ask yourself to really help you kind of arrive at what may make sense as far as a strategy is concerned. The first would be, like I've said before, is there any aid even available for the student, right? Is there a planning opportunity here? If there's no financial aid available, no needs-based aid available, this whole thing may be a non-issue. There's no effort to try to preserve aid if there's no aid to begin with. So if, again, your son, your daughter has relatively strong income at a family level and it doesn't look like they're going to have much of a possibility to obtain needs-based aid for that child, you may not need to go through this exercise. It may not have that big of an impact on how you use this as far as a year-by-year utilization consideration. How do you feel about using available aid or preserving available aid for others, right? This is a very personal decision. Do I want to be sure that if there's $8 on the table, we're going to take advantage of that? If there's a program at the school, if there's a program at the federal level that's going to help us with tuition funding, with how expensive tuition funding is, if there's any help, I want to make sure that we get it. That's a different consideration than I understand that my son, my daughter, their family, they have a significant amount of wealth. The student has a 529 for which they're a beneficiary. They have the means to cover the college tuition, all of the college tuition. Maybe we don't feel right about using aid that others out there could potentially use that may be a little bit needier. And again, that's a completely personal decision. There's no right or wrong there. That's just how do you feel about it. Getting more into bigger picture type thinking, you can fund a 529 with the expectation that this is for my grandchild 18 years from now to use for college. And that's really the way that I've funded this account. That's why we have an account. This is how I envision it being used, versus longer-term family planning. And this brings up an interesting point about how you can use this balance for longer-term family planning. So let's say you've got a grandchild who's got merit and athletic-based scholarships and all of their tuition need has been met without really much of a need for 529 distributions at all. You could get to the end of that at graduation and say, grandson, granddaughter, you've done such a wonderful job that we didn't need to use the 529 to cover your tuition, so there's these dollars left in the plan, and I'd really like you to think about letting that be a longer-term family planning vehicle. You're eventually going to have children of your own. Hopefully those children will also go to college. You can really use this account to get you way ahead of the game in providing for your own children's education needs. In other words, once you have your own kids, you would change the beneficiary from yourself to your child, set that to be a little bit more aggressively invested, and this could, by the time 18 years from now that child's ready to go to school, you could have college tuition funded and paid for. In other words, that's a financial worry you may never have. That'd be one way to think about it, right? Immediate usage versus long-term family planning. There's also the question of how you envision the student using these dollars. Is it strictly for education, or can it be used for more general usage? So some parents out there, and I've talked to them before, have said that I've set aside an amount of money for my son or daughter to go to school. And depending on what school they select, how expensive the tuition is, how much scholarships, need-based aid, merit-based aid, anything like that, whatever they're able to cover is going to theoretically mean more 529 balance available when they're at graduation. You can say you've done a wonderful job. You chose to go to a more affordable school. You paid for more of it with your own intellect. You're not going to be penalized for that. This is your asset. You can do whatever you want with it. Take the money, buy a car, take a trip, do whatever in the world you want. This is a gift that I made to you. Just because you used it for education or because you didn't use it for education doesn't change my opinion. You use it for what you want to. Or you could say, no, this was an account designed for education. You didn't need to use it for education, so it's going to go to other family members that may have a need for education funding. Your brother, for example, wasn't gifted enough to obtain his own merit-based scholarships. He had a tuition shortfall. We're going to change the beneficiary over to him because he needs that asset for education funding. So again, it's a decision between education, specific, or general usage. As it relates to the family dynamic, there's a few considerations that's worthwhile to think through as far as that's concerned is, and we've already talked about this, the financial responsibility of your student. Is this a child, and they're still 18, so I can call them a child, is this a child that you feel comfortable in managing their own financial affairs? If you asked everyone, I'd say the answer to that's less than 50% out there would actually consider an 18-year-old to be financially prepared to be able to manage their own finances. But it's also important to keep in mind that this is a young adult that's headed off to school. They're taking their first steps towards full independence in a matter of years, hopefully. They'll be completely financially independent and out on their own. They're going to need an intro to that at some point. So you could say, yeah, they're a little shaky, but I also understand that sooner or later they're going to need to start managing their own assets. And this gets back to that whole or partial ownership transfer that we talked about before, where if you've got serious questions but you do want to get some control over to the student, you could do partial annual transfers versus the whole account balance transfer. And one way to look at this is it can be a good early step in their own personal financial management, right? That this is a family conversation that we've had. This is an explanation that your grandma and your grandpa, we've set aside money for you to go to school. We're going to allow you to financially manage that. You're going to show a little bit of responsibility here. This is one of your first steps in you're going to be a big boy or big girl and manage your own finances. So this could be a good introduction to that. Another consideration at the family level would be the ability for your own kids to fund college education, potentially for their own grandkids or their own kids, but I'm speaking here more of their own grandkids. If you felt that your own children didn't have a high enough level of income, they're really going to struggle to put their own kids or struggle to help their own eventual grandkids with college, that may influence the way that you view the existing 529 balances that you have, with the understanding that if it's not all consumed by my grandchild, I'm going to strongly encourage them to say, let's preserve this asset for your own children's education, like I just described before. with all of that in mind, you've got the accounts out there. You've got your own sons, your own daughters to speak to, your own grandchildren to speak to about, this is the asset that your grandma and grandpa have set aside for you. Here's how we're going to think about using it. This is really what our intention is, what our wishes are. This is how we desire that you use the account. Remember, once transfer of ownership starts to happen, you can't directly control that anymore. So at some point, that ownership can go away if you do make the decision to transfer ownership. So it's good to be able to communicate that to your family. We worked with a client in a very specific situation where we did some of this planning, and at the end of all of it was a cohesive family conversation to really bring mutual alignment around, here's the assets, here's how we're going to use them, and numbers aside, it was an excellent family bonding opportunity in my opinion, because you got to sit down with 3 generations, talk about a financial related issue, really introduce that grandchild to the kind of financial planning that does go on. I think it was a wonderful outcome of that. So now, after we've talked about the different strategies that are available and the impact of financial aid, I'm going to take a step back and get just a little bit more general about 529 balances, because almost invariably in our conversations when we talk about the potential for funding education for kids or grandkids, people have a certain set of questions, and one of those questions is almost always, well, what if my child goes to college and they graduate and there's money left over in the plan? What then? Or what if they go through high school and I've set aside money for college and they decide, you know what, I'm done with education, I'm not going to go to school. What can I do with this balances? Was it a bad decision for me to fund a 529 if those dollars aren't needed for school? So the answer to that, again, I have to be somewhat general here, but the answer to that is it's almost always not a negative. There's always some good that comes out of funding a 529. Maybe it doesn't get used for its exact intended purposes, but it's almost always a positive. But even if there's dollars left over or there's dollars that aren't needed, there is a pretty high degree of flexibility out there for how those unused dollars can be used. So the first is, well, what if they go to graduate school? What if they elect to pursue a doctorate after they finished graduate school? There could be 2, there could be 5 additional years of education funding to think about. So even if they finish their graduate work, their undergraduate work, with dollars left in the 529, if there's any potential that they're going to pursue additional education after that, or maybe even a few years down the road, they decide to go back and get a master's or something like that. There's no expiration date to 529 balances, so they can be used if any education need arises at any point in the future. It's also important to keep in mind that there's a special provision as it relates to scholarships that the student earns. These would be merit-based scholarships that if they're able to qualify for one, that allows you to take a distribution from a 529 up to the amount of that scholarship without that amount being subject to penalty. Now, unfortunately, there still is some tax there. You don't get away from the income tax component of it, but the penalty part of it does go away. And again, if the student's in a relatively low bracket, either just finishing up their schoolwork or just starting out that entry-level job, their income should be relatively low. The tax burden shouldn't be that meaningful. So the ability to pull those scholarship dollars out without being subject to penalty is a pretty important planning technique. And this is one of those areas where there's no perfect definition, no exact black and white ruling on this. The general consensus around accountants out there is that you can actually aggregate any scholarships earned throughout the student's tenure at school. So you can add up their scholarships from all 4 years, whatever that total to, you could pull those dollars out of the plan, not pay the penalty on it, just pay the tax on it, which if you think back to our first strategy where you had a student loan at the end of the 4 years and there was some scholarships earned along the way, that would make that even more attractive. It would make that cost to utilize that strategy even lower. So it's important to keep that in mind. If none of that applies, there's always the potential for non-qualified distributions. And I've kind of danced around this just a little bit, but if you take dollars out of a 529 plan and you don't use them for a, quote, qualified education expense, you do have the ability to just pull the dollars out and do whatever you want with them. Of course, that's when you run into the tax and the 10% penalty. It's important to keep in mind that that tax and penalty only applies to the gain in the account, not the original dollars that you already put in. So if the account's worth $50,000, your contributions to it totaled $25,000, the tax and the penalty only applies on that second $25,000 of gain in there. All distributions from 529s, by the way, do come out prorated. They always consist of a portion of principal, contribution dollars that you paid in, and gain on the account. So unfortunately, you can't just pull out the original principal amount and get around the tax and penalty that way. It's always going to come out prorated. If you elect not to pursue that, you can change the beneficiary. So when a student graduates, they've used a portion of their 529s, but there's still a meaningful amount left over. You can always consider changing the beneficiary to what they call a qualified family member, which is a fairly broad definition: brothers, sisters, spouses. It goes pretty far. Think immediate family. You can change that beneficiary over to that potential student and then have those dollars available for their own tuition needs. You can even change the beneficiary to yourself, which if you decide to pursue some later in life education, could be a decent use there. Another thing that you can do gets back to what I just described concerning legacy, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, right on down the family line. If you can put aside enough dollars early on, only use enough in each generation to cover the tuition need, and if there's dollars left over, those can be invested for the next in the lineage and the next in the lineage. So you can see if you can build up a pretty decent balance, and then the demand on those 529 balances isn't terribly strong for merit-based aid reasons, or the students working and covering a potential tuition shortfall, or whatever the case may be, there's dollars left over, you could always just keep shifting the beneficiary to grandchildren, great-grandchildren, so on down the line, and allow some of that to cover those later on needs. Lastly, we'll talk for just a few minutes about selecting a state plan. Which state's plan should I use? So the first thing you need to know is there's a lot of states, and the states have different plans. Almost all of them have unique rules and regulations specifically to their own state's plan. It's a very, very independent type structure out there, where most of the, I think 38, I could be off on that, I think 38 of the states have plans, and they're all different. Each one of them operates a little bit different from the others. So if you're thinking about beginning a funding plan, you need to understand what state's plan should I utilize. Most people just think, well, if I live in Missouri, I need to use Missouri's plans. And in a lot of cases, that's going to be fine, but that may not always be the case. So when you're considering funding a 529 plan and opening an account, it makes sense to think about, well, there's quite a few considerations, but the three main considerations that we usually think through is, what state do you live in? What's your state of residency? And the reason is, well, there could be potential state tax implications there. Maybe there is no state tax. In the state of Florida, there's no state tax. Contributions to 529s are typically state tax deductible. I probably should have mentioned that earlier on, but when you fund a 529, there's no federal tax deduction, but there can be a state tax deduction. Well, like in the state of Florida, if there's no state tax, there can't be a state tax deduction, so that may or may not be an impact. If there is a state tax, is there a state tax benefit? For example, the state of California, there is most certainly a state tax. It's one of the highest in the country. But there's no benefit to funding a 529 in the state of California as it relates to 529 contributions. You don't get a state tax deduction. Sure, you can open a 529. It can be a California 529, and sure, you can make contributions to it, but there won't be any in-state tax benefit. That's another important consideration. The other consideration would be, is there what they call parity? And there's, as far as I know, 6 states right now that offer tax parity, meaning if you live in one of these states, you can open a 529 in any state you want and still get that in-state deduction. Whereas the rest of the states, you actually have to fund that particular state's 529 plan to enjoy that state tax deduction. Those states are Maine, Pennsylvania, Montana, Arizona, Kansas, and Missouri. So Missouri is one of those states that if you live here, there is an in-state tax deduction. Your contributions to a 529 do allow you to deduct up to $16,000 if you file jointly on your Missouri tax return. And since Missouri offers tax code parity with the rest of the states, you can make those contributions to any state's 529 plan that you want. which really now opens up a very wide assortment of options as it relates to choosing a state's plan, because you can pick any of them that you want. And that's where we kind of get down to the next two. Before I go into that, though, it's kind of an easy answer. If your state offers if your state has a state tax and offers a deduction at the state level for contributions, and it's only to those states' 529 plans, probably makes sense to use that state's plan. There's a tax benefit there that you won't get if you fund any other state's plans, and assuming it's at all meaningful, it probably makes sense to go ahead and take advantage of that. But if you do live in a state without income tax, if you do live in a state that doesn't offer any in-state contribution benefit, or if you do live in a state that offers parity, if you live in Maine, Pennsylvania, Montana, Arizona, Kansas, or Missouri, then you can now look at all of the state's plans and choose the one that will work the best for you. And that's where the next two criteria come into play. Cost. Cost is always an important consideration. What is the plan level administrative cost for that state's plan, and what are the investment related costs for that state's plan? Over the last, I don't know, 5, 6, 7, 8 years, we've seen quite a bit of change as it relates to specifically the cost structure of different states' plans. There was a time when there was a high degree of variability state to state related to the attractiveness and cost of those states' plans. Some of them were highly actively managed, expensive plans. Some of them were much more index-based, passively managed, lower-cost plans. The trend in the industry over the past several years has been to move to a much more lower-cost, index-based structure, which is music to our ears, of course. Any time we can reduce costs in a world where everything seems to get a little bit more expensive each year, 529 plans are one of those things that's actually going the other direction. They all seem to be getting a little bit cheaper, which is wonderful. It makes selecting a state's plan a little bit easier, because the more similar they all become and the more attractive they all become, the less important it is to kind of, quote, get it right. But there still is quite a bit of variability state to state as it relates to administrative investment costs. The other thing that we like to think about is the construction of the age-based models. So first you need to understand, what is an age-based model? It is an investment option that's usually included in a state's 529 plan that gets a little bit more conservative automatically as the child gets closer to college. It does what we would do if we were managing a cash flow event that was supposed to happen at some point in the future. If you're 18 years away, you've got more time until that need manifests itself. So you have the luxury of being a little bit more aggressive with how those dollars are invested. Well, the closer you get to school, you know that cash flow event's coming up, it's getting closer, you probably want to kind of start to reduce some of that risk, some of that expected volatility in those years leading up to school. That's where age-based models come in handy. They do that automatically, much like your target retirement date funds do that you may have in your 401k that get more conservative the closer you get to retirement. The same thing happens with age-based models, which are nice if you're one of those folks that likes to kind of set it and forget it, right? To just say, I'm going to have one investment option. It's going to be the age-based model for my child. It's going to automatically get more conservative as they get closer to school. It's on, quote, autopilot. I don't really have to worry about it too much. So we'll almost always recommend that people use the age-based models for their state's plan, but usually you have a choice between a conservative age-based model, a moderate age-based model, and maybe an aggressive age-based model, and they'll all have slightly different allocations at the various age brackets for the student. A lot of them, in my opinion, our opinion, can be a little too conservative. You can have some where a 4-year-old has a 60-40, 60% bonds, 40%. 60% stock, 40% bond allocation, which with 14 years till school may be just a little too conservative. So depending on how the age-based models are constructed, and again, those are going to be different state to state to state, that may be something you take into factor. I think that your state residency, deduction and parity, and your plan administrative investment costs are probably the two primary things to think about, but you'll also want to be comfortable with how those age-based models are constructed, and typically those are the three things that we'll look at when we're evaluating a plan. Obviously, it's important to keep in mind, well, have they actually performed the way that they've supposed to? But again, with a shift towards more passive index-based investing in these plans, as long as the passive investment index tracking investments aren't broken, and they use big-time names in the industry like Vanguard. That's what Vanguard does. You'll find a lot of plans are underpinned by Vanguard investments. you don't really have to worry as much about the performance. So to really quickly recap what we talked about, and then we'll open it up for questions here in just a second. 529s are an excellent planning vehicle for education funding. If you've made the decision that you're going to assist a child or a grandchild with education funding, a 529 is almost always the best tool to do that. Obviously, there's exceptions to every rule, but generally speaking, it's a very, very, very powerful planning technique to use. But they are a little bit complex. Unfortunately, there's a lot of tax rules that go into it. There's differences state to state. There's differences between student-owned, grandparent-owned, parent-owned. There's a lot to keep in mind there, and that's why having an individual planning conversation can be pretty important. That those that have experience in the field, that have had conversations, and some expertise to share, can certainly add value to client situations. And I think that's one of the main things that I'd like to express today is, one, hopefully you walk away today with just a little bit greater understanding of the things that you need to think about. Again, there is no black and white, right or wrong answer. There's a lot of shades of gray here. There's a lot of ways that these accounts can be funded and utilized, and there's a lot to think about when it comes down to it. Some of that makes sense from a strictly financial standpoint. Some of that is, like I said, a family dynamic and personal belief system or vision for the accounts kind of thing. So an individual conversation, we think it's pretty important to really help get some of those issues addressed and really help come up with a customized 529 planning strategy that can make the most sense for a grandparent or even a parent as well. So I hope you found a little bit of value in that conversation today. At this point, we'll go ahead and turn it over to any questions that we may have. So Todd, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Ryan. At this time, if you have any additional questions, please feel free to type those into the box, and we'll take just a few minutes here. But there are a couple of questions regarding legacy, so I'm going to stitch those together, Ryan, and ask you and I, and potentially both of us, to speak to them. So that would be under the banner of a legacy question. Would it make sense from a legacy perspective that the asset would intentionally always be transferred down to the parent, who would in this case always be the future grandparent? And then the second question about legacy, tying both those in, would be, would you use an age-based model if your intention all along was to do a legacy? Or would you choose an allocated multi-generational structure? So I kind of tied those two questions together, and if any other questions get typed in, we'll address them as well. But what are your thoughts about that, Ryan?
So that's definitely a good question. When you're thinking about legacy planning, it would at a high level seem to make the most sense to consider transferring ownership to each parent right on down the line. You know, I don't want to make comments about any individual grandchildren or any younger students or anything like that, but a parent controlling that asset could be more desirable from I'm not going to be as tempted to withdraw these dollars and go blow it on myself. Whereas, you know, we were all there before. You know, we all went through our growing pains as we matured as a financial individual, that the temptation to get out and graduate and you've got these dollars in this account and say, well, this is really supposed to be for my own kid's education, but boy, really could use that new car. Having a parent-owned 529 to kind of avoid that temptation, really take that out as a possibility that younger student or graduate is going to think about using that for their own purposes, that by the time it's transferred to them, they now have their own kids. And as someone who has a 2-year-old, I now know once you have a kid, you really start thinking about education funding. At least I hope you do. But it gets a little bit more real for you at that point, so that temptation to use it for purposes for which it was not intended somewhat dissipates at that point. Again, I will say that the one downside to that is if you do happen to have multiple grandchildren in school at the same time and they're all attempting to get financial aid, parent-owned 529 balances can be a little bit more detrimental as far as that application is concerned. It may have a more meaningful impact on any aid that is available. But of course, if you wait to actually transfer ownership until the kids are all out, or if you only have one kid in school at that time, that would make a little bit more sense. As far as the age-based model for legacy planning is concerned, I like the thinking there. You would want to know relatively early on that this asset's not going to be utilized for college in the near term. That I'm comfortable with that not being a possibility, because then you really can open that up to a more static investment structure, which they do have. Most plans do have a static investment structure. You can pick an allocation that'll just stay in place, or at a lot of plans, you can actually create your own allocation. You can pick and choose the investments in whatever combination you'd like, which of course would allow you then to aggressively invest those dollars with the understanding that we could be talking about not my grandkids, we could be talking about my great-great-grandkids. It could be 50, 60 years here before these dollars end up potentially being used. Really difficult to forecast that far. Very, very difficult, in my opinion, to project the need for an individual who's already born going to school as soon as 14, 15, 16 years from now, and you're kind of trying to project generations into the future. Can be somewhat difficult to do, but assuming you can have reasonable clarity about the use, the timing for potential use here, that allows you a pretty good amount of control over how those dollars are invested. Maybe the easy way to answer that question is if you're considering this to be a legacy planning vehicle, I think you go from the standpoint of let's use this as a legacy planning vehicle. Let's position these assets for more aggressive growth. If we come to the point that it looks to be a possibility that the dollars are going to be needed maybe sooner than we had originally planned on, hopefully we've got enough notice to be able to take some additional steps at that time.
Thank you. And another couple of questions. I appreciate that good thought there, Ryan. If we are to transfer these assets to a kid or a grandchild, would there be a gift tax consideration if the amount was over the amount we're limited by?
The answer to that question is no. So when you fund a 529, that is the completed gift. You've set money aside into this planning vehicle. That is the reportable gift. There's no income tax considerations there as it relates to the gifting part of it. It is a gift tax issue, however. So as long as you make contributions that are under the annual gift exclusion, contributions to the 529 plan for your grandchild aren't going to be reported as a taxable gift. If you exceed that amount, then that could be potentially reported as a taxable gift, but there is a unique to 529 planning provisions that allows an individual to fund up to 5 years worth of annual gift exclusion all at once. You have to file a Form 709, which is your gift tax return, that basically says, yes, I put in 5 times the annual gift exclusion amount, but that's basically my 5 years worth all rolled into one. Now, you can't make any additional contributions over that intervening 5 years, and you have to live for that full 5 years, or a prorated portion will be included in your estate. But that's the contribution high-level overview of funding a 529. Once you've made that, you've completed your gift. So you can transfer ownership, and you can change beneficiaries at that point without additional gift tax complications.
Thank you, Ryan. That appears to be all of the questions for today. We'll remind each of you of a couple of things. One, we appreciate that you took time to participate in our webinar. We hope you found value in it. Importantly, we know the specific situation in your family is going to be a little bit different, so we do look very forward to the conversation around your unique situation to include your grandchildren. And one helpful piece of homework for any of you that want to have a more specific conversation around this is to give a pretty honest assessment to us of where your children are and where your grandkids are to the best of your knowledge. We know we can't divine the future on such things, but it is a great research project for you as grandparents to spend time with your grandchildren to try to ascertain a little bit more about their expectations if you are comfortable having financial conversations with your grandkids. Lastly, I would note that we will make a transcript available of this webinar, and if you have any friends or family members that you think need to hear these basics, we are surely available to help you provide that information and content to them. So again, if no further questions come in, we want to wish each of you a wonderful day, and thank you for sharing 55 minutes with us. that'll conclude things. So thank you very much.